Hey guys, I just wanted to talk a little bit about traceability at sea. When we think about traceability, we often think from the moment that we land and that it's quite obvious what's landed, and that from then on you kind of need to find out how you do the traceability throughout the supply chain. But actually there's a lot which we just heard a little bit about already. There's a lot happening at sea, what makes it very complicated. So even making sure that you know what's actually being landed and where it's coming from is quite a challenging issue. So for example, this kind of some of the areas that are big risks and that need a certain level of oversight is where are the fishing boats? If the fishing boats are closer inshore, it might be easier to know where they are and to have oversight and to control them. But where the big challenges are the big vessels that is being talked about. They're somewhere on the high sea. They might be away for months in a row, never actually come to shore, and just be out there fishing and processing at sea, or partly processing at sea. So what's exactly happening there? Do they stick to the quota? Where did they stay within the areas that they have the right to fish in or not? Is one of the big areas. Then what's just been talked about as well, and how do these big vessels that are away for a long time get their fish to shore? It's because they transship them. And to some extent we were just talking about that being illegal. They're handing over a quota which they might not have the right to, but to some extent that's also something that they're just allowed to do. They can have a mothership out of the sea that's continuously fishing, and smaller vessels that are going back into the ports to land the fish. That's not something that is as such illegal to do, but it is obviously something that makes it much harder to control where the fish is coming from, where it was being caught. So transshipment is something that creates a lot of worries for NGOs and people that are after traceability. One other area that we heard a lot about is what's happening with the people on the vessels. We've heard about issues with forced labor, with just generally the labor conditions. So how do you control what's happening on those boats? It's a lot harder compared to on a factory or a farm that is land-based, and we really know how hard it can be to actually know what that's going on. But how do you do an unannounced audit of a fishing vessel? I mean, that would mean you send a helicopter and they probably kind of see you coming. And one of the other challenges, because what is important for defining whether it's sustainable depends on what kind of gear they're using. So they might have gear that is all aligned with the regulations. Sometimes it's regulations, sometimes it's required by a sustainability scheme, but they might have certain gear that they're allowed to use and other gear that they're not allowed to use. They might, all happily kind of go out with the right gear, but who checks whether they don't switch the gear sometime during the night and then catch with a much smaller maze? How do we check that? So those are a couple of areas that are big risks that require oversight. So the question is, what's the best way to do that? So there's a couple of different tools that I already kind of heard several people mentioning over the past hours that I've been here. There is VMS, Vessel Monitoring Scheme, that's working on GPS. There is the AIS, which is satellite oriented, that keeps track of where vessels are. This is originally developed to avoid collisions between vessels, so they can communicate where they are, which direction they're going into. But it also allows for oversight. These are things that they can turn on and off though, which makes it a little bit tricky sometimes. They might be connected to an e-logbook, which is obviously helping and provides information, but it's also something that they are in control of themselves. Another tool that is increasingly being used to have oversight is cameras on board. They can look at what's happening, they can look at the gear, they can look at what fish is being caught, they can just generally keep track of things. And then thirdly is actually in-person observers. That's also a tool that's being used to create oversight on the vessels. The independence of these people are obviously a challenge, but these are the three main tools that I at the moment aware of that are being used to control. So it's the VMS AIS that kind of tracks where they are, the cameras and the observers. So and then there's also developing tools, whether it's Google is involved in this project, where they're using the Google satellites to actually track where the vessels are. Because interestingly, you can know quite a bit of the movement of the vessels at the sea, what they're doing. So whether they're fishing or not, to some extent what gear they're using, but also, for example, when there's two vessels coming closer to each other or really near to each other, having the same speed, which is generally an indication that there's transshipment happening. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to stall, they just need to move in the same direction at the same speed for a while. So there are ways of kind of starting to get more information about what's going on at sea. However, there's a couple of big challenges, and I know that's what you guys are after, because you're going to solve them for us. So the observers, obviously the in-person observers, on the one hand, that's great. It's, sorry guys, sometimes better than technology. However, it's costly. To some extent, it's dangerous. Do you want to be that one person on the boat saying that there's something happening that's not right? We're not 100% sure if you actually return back to shore, and that's not an exaggeration. And there's obviously a challenge with independence. Who's putting that person there? Is it, if you're hired by the company, obviously that's not very independent. But even if they're officially independent, if they're always working in the same port with the same people, they go to the same pub when they're back on shore, how independent really are you? If you're trying to have oversight in Indonesia, in Peru, only because the people in the US or Europe want to know what's going on, they might eventually back their peers in their countries and not tell to the US. So that's one of the big challenges with observers. So then what about camera footage? That might, obviously that doesn't require that one person on there. It helps that you can view a lot more vessels at the same time remotely. But there's a big challenge with storing the data. Do you want all that real-time information of what was happening on a vessel all the time? Probably not. The majority of the time nothing is happening, and secondly, it creates an enormous storage problem. So one of the things that's very interesting there is to see if you can find tools where you can just only review or save the relevant information. So only kind of have those moments where you see two vessels coming together, or when you see that the movement of the vessel is changing, which means that they might change or start fishing or stop fishing or change gear. And that are the indications that gives you information about what's actually going on, and trying to only save that. On saving data and storage, also one of the things I think is very relevant is to make sure that you only save the actual confirmation. You don't need all the underlying data, whether you're in the supply chain or on the water. You don't need all the different kind of sub things. What you want is kind of, hey, it's confirmed. Yes, there were two vessels together, they were transshipping, but we had the camera at that time on there, and we actually verified that it was the two boats that we're familiar with. They know, and they're illegal. It's a legal handover, so that's all kind of ticked. So the only thing that you could store is there was transshipment happening, and the transshipment was valid or was locked in a logbook or whatever. So that's then the last thing is about what do you want to do with the VMS data, with the e-logbook, and an important part of that is cross-checking that information. It's something they enter, but the interesting thing is that it's that is digital, so it makes it possible to already check some of that information while they're still out there on the water, and if you verify that information, but information that's coming, for example, from camera footage from the satellites, then suddenly you can verify that it all makes sense, and eventually, you probably won't be able to kind of solve all-purpose crime if they make the whole thing up, but you make it at least a lot harder because everything kind of needs to talk to each other and to match. So just a couple of things on the top of my head, thinking about traceability and what's happening at sea that I'm struggling with from day to day. I work for the Marine Stewardship Council and I'm responsible for the traceability program. Just throwing some things out to you guys that I'm struggling on a daily basis.
Thank you.